At 7:42 on a Tuesday evening in February, my card was declined for the third time for a dinner bill of $46 on an account that had moved through it without a single problem for 11 years. The waiter apologized like it was his fault. I told him it was fine, and I meant it, because by the time he walked away, I had already stopped thinking about the bill and started thinking about the account itself, which was the first mistake my father made that night, though he would not understand what that meant for months yet. When I called him from the parking lot, he answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting for it. "I canceled them," he said before I'd even asked. "You've been living off this family for 11 years, Meredith. That ends tonight." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I said, "Okay," and hung up and stood in that parking lot for a long moment doing the only thing I have ever been good at doing when I'm angry, which is math. My name is Meredith Voss, and at the time all of this happened, I was 34 years old, living in Columbus, Ohio, in a one-bedroom condo I had bought myself 4 years earlier with a down payment I had saved by living beneath my means for the better part of a decade. I was a senior forensic accountant at a firm called Whitcomb and Sayer, which meant that my job, every single day, was to look at numbers that other people had arranged to look normal and find the place where they weren't. I found the gap between what a company said had happened and what had actually happened. I had done it for a regional hospital system that had been overbilling insurers for 3 years running. I had done it for a manufacturing company whose CFO had been quietly folding inventory losses into an account nobody thought to audit. I was good at it. I want you to remember that, because it matters later. My father is Richard Voss. He is 63 years old, and for almost 30 years he has run a commercial real estate development company called Voss Development Group, which built strip malls and mid-rise office parks across central Ohio during the years when that was still a reliably good business to be in. He built that company from nothing, and he says so often in almost exactly those words, and it's true, and it is also the sentence he has used for my entire life to justify almost anything he has ever wanted justified. My mother used to say that my father built 2 things in his life: his company and an idea of himself that the company had to keep proving true. My mother, Diane, died when I was 26. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by October, 8 months from a routine blood work appointment to a funeral in a church that felt too big for how few people actually knew her well. She was quieter than my father in every visible way and much harder underneath it. Her own money came from her side of the family, not his. Her father had built a small chain of hardware stores across 3 counties, 6 locations, and sold the whole operation 2 years before I was born, for a sum that after taxes and reinvestment came to a little over $2 million by the time she inherited it in her 40s. She never touched most of it. She used to tell me that money you don't need yet is money you protect, not money you spend, and I did not understand what she meant by that until I was 34 years old, standing in a restaurant parking lot with a declined card in my hand. When she was dying, she set up a trust. I was 26, in my first year at Whitcomb and Sayer, still learning the difference between what people tell you and what the numbers tell you. And she decided, on the advice of the estate attorney who had known her since college, a man named Thomas Reyes, that the trust would pass to me in full when I turned 35. Not 26, not 30. 35, she said, because she wanted me to have already built a life of my own before that kind of money sat under me, and because, I would learn much later, she wanted enough time to pass that certain things would have already revealed themselves on their own. Until then, the trust would be administered by a trustee. She named my father. I asked her about it once, half joking, the way you joke about things that make you a little uneasy, Why him? She said something I did not think about again for 8 years. Because if it's not him, everyone will ask why, and I don't want anyone asking why yet. At the time, I thought she meant she didn't want to insult him. I understand now that she meant something closer to a controlled experiment. I was the kind of daughter my father used to introduce at parties as the reliable one, which I understood, even as a teenager, was not entirely a compliment. When I was 19, home from college for a long weekend, he called me near midnight from his office because a printer had jammed before a bid deadline and no one else was around to fix it. I drove 20 minutes through the rain and cleared a paper jam out of a copier while he paced behind me, already back on the phone with a client, already moving on to the next problem before I'd finished solving this one. I remember feeling, even then, a strange, proud ache at being needed. The specific ache of a kid who has learned that being useful is a more reliable way to be loved than simply being present. I carried that lesson into my 30s without ever really examining it. The credit cards, the ones that got declined that Tuesday in February, were not really mine, not in the way people mean when they say my credit card. They were authorized cards on an account that ran through a small holding company my father had set up the year my mother got sick, called Voss Family Holdings LLC, which existed on paper to simplify certain tax and estate matters while her affairs were being settled. I was an authorized user, not an owner. I had held 2 cards on that account since I was 26. One I used almost exclusively for flowers and upkeep at my mother's grave, a florist subscription and a landscaping contract I had set up so the plot never looked forgotten, and one I kept, mostly unused, for the kind of family emergency my father insisted on: a flat tire on a road trip, a hotel room if a flight got canceled. In 11 years, I do not believe I put more than $400 a month through either card, and most months it was far less. I had my own bank account, my own mortgage, my own retirement contributions, all separate, all mine, because independence had never actually been the problem. I want that understood clearly because it is the entire hinge of what happened next. My father was not disciplining a daughter who couldn't manage money. He was building a story in front of the one daughter he had who would eventually know how to read it. Josh was the one waiting for me at the table when I walked back inside that night. We had been together 3 years by then, an ER nurse at Riverside Methodist who worked overnight shifts and somehow still remembered to make a Tuesday reservation, because it was close to the anniversary of the night we met in a hospital cafeteria at 2 in the morning, where I had gone for coffee before a client meeting and he had gone for coffee during an actual emergency. I told him the card had been declined and that my father had canceled it. I told him I was fine. He knew me well enough not to argue with that sentence, and well enough to know it wasn't entirely true. He paid for dinner. We didn't talk about it again that night, and I let him believe that was because I didn't want to. Really, it was because I already had a list forming in my head, the kind of list I make at work, and I did not yet trust myself to say it out loud without sounding like exactly the reckless, ungrateful daughter my father had just accused me of being. Here is what bothered me, lying awake at 1 in the morning while Josh slept beside me. My father had not just said he canceled the cards. He'd said I had been living off this family for 11 years, not using, not relying on, living off like I was a dependent, like there was a dollar figure behind that phrase large enough to justify the tone in his voice. And Richard Voss does not use round, dramatic language by accident. In 30 years of watching him run a company, I had learned that my father chooses his words the way he chooses tenants, carefully, for what they signal to whoever is in the room. If he told me I had drained this family, in his own mind, he had a number, I did not know what that number was, but I knew, with the specific, cold certainty that has made me good at my job, that whatever number he had in his head did not match what I had actually spent. I didn't call him back the next morning. I didn't call my stepmother, Vanessa, either, though I assumed by then she already knew. She and my father had been married 5 years, long enough that she had developed opinions about the family finances. She was not shy about sharing at holidays, always phrased as concern, always, landing like a closed door. Instead, I did the thing I do at work when a client hands me a story instead of a ledger. I opened a blank spreadsheet. I titled it, with a flatness that would have alarmed anyone who knew what it meant, VFH Reconciliation. Voss Family Holdings, and I started writing down everything I actually remembered charging to those cards over the last 2 years, month by month from memory, before I had even requested a single statement. It came to $11,420 across 24 months. Flowers, landscaping, 2 hotel rooms, a set of snow tires the winter my car broke down outside Zanesville. Not nothing, not enormous, not 11 years of living off anyone. I want to be honest about what I felt that week, because the version of this story where I discover a betrayal and immediately become a steely avenger is not a true version, and I do not think it is true for anyone. What I felt, mostly underneath the calm, was a very old, very familiar ache. The kind you get used to carrying so early that you stop noticing the weight of it. The specific hurt of being the responsible one in a family that only seemed to notice you when it was time to blame you for something. I had spent 11 years being the daughter who called to check on him after board meetings went badly, who drove 2 hours on a Sunday to fix his printer, who never once asked him for money because I had decided, very young, that needing nothing from him was the only kind of safety I could guarantee myself. And in one phone call, in one sentence, he had rewritten all of that into a debt I apparently owed him. I did not call to defend myself. I have learned in 11 years of forensic work that the moment you start defending yourself against a story, you have already accepted that it's a debate. It isn't a debate. It's a set of facts, sitting somewhere, waiting to be found. So instead of calling my father, I called Thomas Reyes. Thomas had been my mother's attorney since before I was born, and after she died, he had become the kind of family friend who sends a card every year on the anniversary of her death, and never once forgets, though he is careful never to make you talk about it if you don't want to. He was 71 that year, mostly retired, still keeping a small office above a bakery in German Village where he handled a handful of estates for families he had known for decades, because, he told me once, some people you don't hand off to a stranger. I called him the morning after I built my spreadsheet and asked, as casually as I could manage, whether a beneficiary of an irrevocable trust had any right to see an accounting before the distribution date. There was a pause on the line longer than the question should have needed. "Why are you asking me that, Meredith?" he said, and it wasn't really a question either. I told him about the cards. I told him what my father had said. I did not tell him what I suspected, because I did not yet fully know what I suspected. I only knew the shape of the hole where an explanation should have been. Thomas was quiet again, and then he said something I wrote down the second we hung up, word for word, because 20 years of forensic work has taught me that the sentence someone says right before they change the subject is usually the sentence that matters most. He said, "Your mother built more protection into that trust than your father knows about. I think it's time you saw the actual document, not the summary he's probably been giving you at Thanksgiving." Then he told me to come to his office Thursday, to bring nothing, and to tell no one. That Thursday is where the real work started, and if I'm honest, it is the part of this story I remember most clearly, more clearly than the confrontations themselves, because it is the part where I stopped being someone's daughter for a while and started being, for a few months, exactly what I am for a living. Thomas gave me a copy of the full trust instrument, 41 pages, and for the first time I read the actual language instead of the version my father had summarized for me over the years in phrases like, "Your mother wanted me to look after it until you're settled," buried in Article 7, added as an amendment 11 months before she died, was a clause neither my father nor I had ever discussed, because as far as I could tell, my father had never actually read past the sections that named him trustee. It gave any vested beneficiary, me, the right to petition for an accounting at any time upon reasonable belief of a breach of fiduciary duty. And it named Thomas Reyes as trust protector, a kind of outside referee with the authority to remove a trustee immediately without a courtroom, if that belief held up against the actual records. My mother had built a trapdoor into her own estate plan and never told either of us it was there. I asked Thomas why she had done it. He looked at me for a long moment before he answered, the way people look at you when they are deciding how much of someone else's private grief actually belongs to you too. "Your mother loved your father," he said. She also watched Voss Development Group nearly go under twice in the 90s, both times because he moved money somewhere it wasn't supposed to go and fixed it before anyone noticed. She told me, about a year before she died, if Richard ever needs the money more than he needs to be honest, I want her protected. I didn't think we would ever need that page, Meredith. I hoped we wouldn't. I did not cry in his office. I want to be clear about that, not because I am proud of it, but because it is true, and because the not crying is part of what this story is actually about. I thanked him. I asked him to help me request the LLC's bank records under the accounting clause, quietly, before we told my father anything. And I went home and started building the file that would end up, 6 months later, sitting on a conference room table in a binder an inch and a half thick. The next several weeks looked, from the outside, like nothing was happening. That was the point. I went to work every day and did my actual job, which occasionally meant catching myself applying the exact same methodology to my own family that I was applying that quarter to a client supply chain fraud, and having to sit with how strange that felt. I went to my father's house for Sunday dinner twice during that stretch, sat at the same table, ate the same overcooked pot roast Vanessa has made every third Sunday since she married him, and said nothing. Vanessa mentioned, almost in passing, over dessert one week, that Richard had been impossible for the last 2 months, holed up in his office at night, snapping at her whenever she asked about the Meridian Row project, and that some man from the bank had come by the office twice asking for documents Richard didn't want to hand over. I filed that away the way I file away every offhand comment a client's spouse makes during an interview, not proof of anything on its own, but a thread. I have learned that threads are worth pulling even when you don't yet know what's on the other end. About 3 weeks into all of this, my father called me on a Wednesday afternoon out of nowhere and asked if I wanted to get lunch that Saturday, just the two of us, somewhere I used to like as a kid. He didn't mention the cards. He didn't mention the parking lot at all. He asked about a work trip I'd mentioned to Vanessa the week before, and he sounded, for 20 minutes on the phone, like a completely different man than the one who had told me I'd been living off this family for 11 years. I said yes to lunch before I'd fully thought it through, and I hung up and sat in my car in the Whitcomb and Sayer parking garage for a long time, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, which was hope, the specific, humiliating hope of a daughter who has spent her whole life waiting for her father to simply be kind without an angle attached to it. I almost let that lunch be enough. I want to admit that plainly, because I think it's the part of this story people relate to most, even if they never say it out loud. It would have been so much easier to accept the warmth and let the questions go quiet. What stopped me wasn't willpower. It was going home that same night and finding, in the third bank statement I'd requested from the LLC, a $50,000 transfer dated the Monday before his phone call. 3 days before he asked me to lunch, he had not called because he missed me. He had called because he needed to know how much I already knew. So I kept going. Meridian Row was the development my father had broken ground on 2 years earlier, a mixed-use retail and office project on the east side that was supposed to be the largest thing Voss Development Group had ever built. $42 million of financing, anchored by a grocery chain that pulled out of its lease 11 months in, when the surrounding retail failed to fill up on schedule. I knew about the project the way you know things about a parent's business when you love them but don't work for them. Headlines, half-finished sentences at dinner, a groundbreaking photo he had sent me 18 months earlier that I still had somewhere in my phone. What I hadn't known, what took me 3 weeks of evening and weekend work to find, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop and a growing stack of printed statements, was that Meridian Row had been bleeding roughly $900,000 a year in unbudgeted carrying costs since the anchor tenant walked, and that Voss Development Group's operating accounts, according to the liens 2 subcontractors had filed against the project after going unpaid for framing and electrical work, had been short by exactly the kind of numbers that make a company start looking for money in places it isn't supposed to look. On a Saturday in the middle of all this, I drove out to see Meridian Row myself, which wasn't strictly necessary for the file, but some part of me needed to see the actual shape of what my mother's money had become. It was exactly what the liens had described, and somehow worse in person, a half-finished steel frame behind a chain-link fence, a leasing sign for retail space that had clearly been out in the weather for over a year, weeds coming up through gravel that was supposed to be a parking lot by then. A man in a reflective vest was loading tools into a truck at the far end of the lot, and when I asked, careful not to say who I was, whether the site was still active, he laughed in a way that wasn't really a laugh, and said the framing crew hadn't been paid in 4 months, and that he was only there that day to collect equipment his company still owned. I didn't give him my last name. I sat in my car for a while afterward, looking at a project my father had once sent me a groundbreaking photo of, both of us smiling, 18 months earlier, and I understood, in a way the bank statements alone hadn't quite made real, exactly what he had been protecting when he decided my name was the safer place to put the blame. The LLC statements Thomas helped me obtain told the rest of it, and I remember the exact night I found the pattern, because I had to get up from the table and stand at my kitchen window for almost 10 minutes before I trusted myself to sit back down and keep reading. Starting 19 months earlier, Voss Family Holdings LLC, the account that held my 2 modest credit cards, funded almost entirely by my mother's trust, had made 14 separate transfers into Voss Development Group's operating account, labeled in the LLC's own internal ledger as family distributions. 14 transfers, $680,000 in total, not to me, not to any family member. Straight into my father's company at almost the exact moments, month for month, that the subcontractor liens showed Meridian Row falling behind on payments. And here is the piece that took my breath away in a way none of the rest of it had, because it finally explained the phone call in the parking lot. In the same internal ledger, in the same column where the $680,000 was recorded going out to his own company, my father kept a separate summary page. the kind you would hand to an accountant or to a nervous second wife who kept asking questions about the family finances. On that page, the outgoing transfers were not labeled as distributions to Voss Development Group at all. They were labeled, across 14 line items, as distributions to me. My name, next to a number 30 times larger than anything I had actually spent, on a document I had never seen, built for an audience I could only assume was Vanessa, or the bank, or both. My father had not simply been draining my mother's trust to keep his company alive. He had built a paper trail in advance, blaming me for it, so that if anyone ever asked where $680,000 had gone, the answer sitting in his own files would already say, "Ask my daughter." I sat with that for a long time, longer than I want to admit. There is a specific kind of grief in realizing that the story someone tells about you isn't just unfair, it's engineered, built in advance, the way you'd build a wall before you knew you'd need one. My father had not lost his temper on the phone that Tuesday. He had opened a document he'd been preparing for months and read me my part in it. I called Josh that night, later than I should have. I didn't tell him the number yet. I wasn't ready to say it out loud to anyone who wasn't Thomas, but I told him I'd found something and that I was okay, and that I might need him to just sit with me for a while without asking questions. He came over with Thai food and a spare set of scrubs he kept at my place for exactly this kind of night, and he sat across from me while I organized bank statements into a 3-ring binder by date, and he didn't ask a single question until close to midnight when he finally said, "Is he going to be okay, whatever this is?" I remember thinking that was such a Josh question. Not is she going to be okay, not are you safe, but a genuine, uncomplicated concern for the man who had hurt me, because Josh has never once in 3 years asked me to hate my father the way I sometimes thought I should. I told him I honestly didn't know, and that for the first time in a long time, it wasn't my job to protect the answer to that question. It was my job to find out what was true. My boss, Elaine, a woman who has run forensic engagements for over 20 years, and can read a distracted employee the way I read a falsified ledger, called me into her office in the middle of all this and asked, without preamble, whether I needed to hand off a client. I told her I was fine, which was becoming something of a theme in my life that spring. She looked at me for a moment, the particular look she gives junior staff, right before she tells them something useful, and said, "You do good work when it isn't personal, Meredith. Just make sure you're not the last person in the room to see what's actually in front of you, the way clients sometimes are." I don't think she knew what I was working on. I have wondered since whether she suspected anyway. By the end of that 6th week, the binder held 43 documents: the trust instrument, the accounting request, and Thomas's formal response letters, 19 months of LLC bank statements, the 2 subcontractor liens on the Meridian Row project, a spreadsheet reconciling every one of my own actual card charges against the fabricated distribution summary, and a timeline, built the way I build timelines for clients, laying 14 transfers next to 14 moments where Meridian Row's public permit and lien filings showed the project running out of cash. It was, without exaggeration, the cleanest case file I had built in 11 years of doing this professionally, and it was about my own father, which is a sentence I still have some trouble saying out loud without my voice doing something I don't like. I did not confront him the moment. I had enough, and I want to be honest about why. Part of it was strategy. Thomas advised me to let the accounting request run its full formal course, so nothing could later be dismissed as a family argument that got out of hand. But part of it, the part I have thought about more since, is that some quiet portion of me was still hoping, every single week, that the next document would explain it differently. that I would find a version where it was a loan, properly documented, that he'd simply forgotten to mention. That version never showed up. What showed up instead in the final week was a short email exchange between my father and the bank financing Meridian Row, forwarded to Thomas by a contact he had known there for years, in which a loan officer flagged irregular related party transfers and requested a full accounting of the LLC's activity within 30 days, or the file would be referred to the bank's internal fraud unit. More than half that window was already gone by the time I found the letter. He had not been disciplining me. He had been buying himself a story to tell before someone else told a different one. That is the moment I stopped waiting. I called Thomas and told him I was ready. We didn't ambush him. Thomas insisted on that, and I agreed, because the version of this story where I show up empty-handed and disorganized only helps my father, whose entire career has been built on staying calm while other people lose their composure. So we did it his way in one sense: a Sunday, a dinner, the same table, the same overcooked pot roast. Except this time I brought the binder, because I wanted him to see, before I said a single word about what was in it, that this was not a conversation he would be steering. Vanessa noticed the binder before he did. I watched her eyes go to it when I set it on the credenza by the door, and something crossed her face that I would spend a lot of time thinking about later. Not surprise, exactly, more the specific flinch of someone bracing for a door they have been quietly leaning against for a while. I waited until dessert, the way I would in any interview I run for work, because people tell you more when they think the hard part is already over. Then I asked my father, plainly, without any heat in my voice, how much money he believed I had spent on the Voss family holdings cards over the last 2 years. He said a number: $680,000. He said it fast, the way you say a number you have said before to someone else in some other room. I let it sit in the air a second longer than was comfortable, and then I opened the binder to the reconciliation page and slid it across the table and told him my actual total was $11,420, and that I could account for every charge because I had, going back 24 months. He didn't look at the page. That told me almost as much as anything else in the binder did. He said I was twisting things, that I didn't understand how the business accounts worked, that family money moves around, Meredith. That's not theft. That's how families with anything actually built work. I asked him, still without raising my voice, whether he could explain the 14 transfers from the LLC into Voss Development Group's operating account, $680,000, timed to the exact months Meridian Row's subcontractors filed liens for non-payment. He went very still. Vanessa, beside him, went stiller. "That is not your business," he said. "That trust isn't yours yet. It's my mother's business," I said. "And she made it mine the day she wrote the accounting clause into Article 7, which I don't think you've read since the week you signed it." I didn't say it to wound him. I said it because it was, simply, true, and because for the first time in the conversation I watched something in his face actually change. Not guilt yet, but the specific look of a man realizing the room contains information he doesn't control. He tried a few more angles. He reminded me of the tuition he had paid, of a wedding he never got to help plan because I had chosen someone like Josh. A low blow that had nothing to do with anything. The kind people reach for once the real argument is already lost. Vanessa, to her credit, or maybe just her own self-preservation, finally spoke quietly and asked him if the bank auditor who had come by his office twice was about this. He didn't answer her. That was its own answer. I told him I wasn't there to yell, and I wasn't there to negotiate, and I wasn't interested in doing this at his dinner table a second time. I told him Thomas would be filing the formal petition that week, and that he had the chance, before then, to bring an accounting of his own, on his own terms, rather than mine. Then I closed the binder, thanked Vanessa for dinner because some habits from 34 years of being raised to be polite don't disappear just because you finally have a spine. And I left. The second meeting happened 17 days later, in a conference room on the 9th floor of a building downtown that belonged to neither Thomas's firm nor my father's. Chosen, Thomas said, specifically because neutral ground changes how people behave. The room had the particular sterility of a space nobody actually works in day to day. A long table, a credenza with water glasses no one touched, a window looking out at a parking structure instead of anything worth looking at. My father brought his own attorney, a sharp, tired-looking man named Colin Ashford, who I got the sense had been hired about 2 weeks too late to actually help. Vanessa did not come. I noticed that, and I think my father noticed me noticing it. Thomas walked through the accounting request first, formally, for the record, the way he would have done it whether or not the outcome was already decided, because that is the kind of attorney he is. Then it was my turn, and I did what I do for a living. I laid out the timeline, the 14 transfers, the $680,000, the fabricated distribution summary with my name on it, the liens, the bank's own fraud referral letter, whose 30-day window had nearly run out by then. I did not raise my voice once. I did not need to. The documents did what documents do when they are accurate, which is make a room very quiet. Colin Ashford asked a few careful questions, the kind meant to find a crack in the timeline rather than dispute the numbers themselves. Because I don't think he had found a way to dispute the numbers. There wasn't one. My father sat through most of it looking at a spot on the table somewhere past his own hands, and I want to describe what defeat actually looked like on his face, because it wasn't what I had imagined for 11 years of half expecting this reckoning without knowing I was expecting it. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't do any of the things I had privately, guiltily hoped he might do. Some proof this had cost him something visible. He just got quieter and older looking in the specific way people do, when a version of themselves they had been maintaining finally runs out of road. Near the end, he asked to speak to me alone for a few minutes, and Thomas, after checking with me, allowed it, though he stayed in the room. My father said quietly that he hadn't set out to steal from me. He said the project had needed 6 weeks of cash, just 6 weeks, until a refinancing closed, and then it had needed 6 more, and then the refinancing fell through entirely. And by the time he understood how deep the hole was, he told himself the trust would simply look like it had grown a little slower than expected by the time I turned 35, and no one would ever need to know. He said my name was on that fabricated summary because Vanessa had started asking questions about the LLC statements 8 months earlier, and he needed an answer that wasn't the true one, and I was, in his words, the answer that made the least trouble. I let him finish. I didn't forgive him in that room, and I want to be honest that I still haven't, not fully, not in the tidy way these stories sometimes promise. But I told him I heard him because that was true, and because it was the last true thing I planned to give him for a while. The formal outcome took another 6 weeks to finalize. Thomas, using the trust protector provision, removed my father as trustee and appointed an independent corporate trustee to hold what remained of the account until my 35th birthday. My father agreed, through his attorney, to repay the $680,000 over 4 years, secured against his equity in Voss Development Group, rather than face a referral to the bank's fraud unit or a civil suit Thomas was fully prepared to file. It wasn't justice in the movie sense. Nobody went to prison. Nobody apologized on their knees. But the money came back, on paper, and eventually in fact, and the trapdoor my mother had built 8 years before any of us needed it held exactly the weight she had designed it to hold. The family did not respond the way I might have hoped, and I have made a kind of peace with that, though it took longer than I expected. My father's sister, my aunt, Carol, called me 2 weeks after the story got around the family. Because of course it got around. These things always do, in careful, half-accurate versions passed at a christening or over a phone call that starts with "I heard something," and told me she thought I was being awfully hard on him for a man his age. As though age were a mitigating factor for $680,000 and a fabricated ledger with my name on it. I told her, as calmly as I had told my father everything else, that she was welcome to look at the documents herself before she decided how hard I was being. She didn't take me up on it. Some people would rather keep a comfortable story than open an uncomfortable file. Not everyone reacted like my aunt. My cousin Danielle, who had spent a decade quietly resenting her own mother's habit of treating my father's success as a kind of family currency everyone else was expected to defer to, texted me a single line the week the story got around. Good, someone finally did the math. We hadn't been close in years. We are now in the small, specific way you become close to someone who turns out to have been standing on the same ground as you the whole time, just quieter about it. Vanessa left him 4 months after the second meeting. I don't know the full shape of what happened in their marriage during that stretch, and I have decided I don't need to, but I do know she called me once, unprompted, in the 5th month, and said she wanted me to know she hadn't known about the trust specifically. Only that money had been tight and Richard had been strange about it, and that she was sorry for every comment she'd made over the years about my spending without knowing what she was actually defending. It wasn't a full accounting of her own choices, and I don't think it was meant to be. But it was more than my father ever gave me unprompted, and I told her I appreciated the call because I did. Voss Development Group survived, technically. My father brought in a minority partner to cover the repayment obligation and the Meridian Row shortfall, a firm out of Columbus that specializes in distressed commercial projects. And by the terms of that deal, he is no longer the majority owner of the company he built from nothing, the company whose story he had told at every dinner table of my childhood as proof of who he was. I won't pretend I felt nothing when Thomas told me that detail. There was a version of me, the 26-year-old at my mother's funeral who still wanted her father to be exactly who he said he was, that felt something close to grief on his behalf. There was another version, the one standing in the restaurant parking lot with a declined card that understood it as the closest thing to consequence this story was ever going to hand him, and let that be enough. We speak now, my father and I, maybe once every 6 or 7 weeks, careful, short conversations that stay on safe ground, my job, the weather, whether I've seen a specific building he drove past that used to be a Voss development project. We have not talked about the $680,000 since the day in that conference room. I don't know if we ever fully will. I have stopped needing that conversation to happen on a schedule I control, which is its own kind of progress, even if it doesn't look like the reconciliation people probably want for me when they hear this story. I turned 35 in October, 8 months after that Tuesday in the restaurant parking lot, and the independent trustee Thomas had appointed transferred what remained of my mother's trust into my own name on the exact date the original document specified, as though none of the last 8 months had happened at all, as though my mother's paperwork had simply outlasted my father's version of events, the way she'd apparently always suspected it might have to. I used part of it to pay off the rest of my mortgage. I used another part, 6 months later, to leave Whitcomb and Sayer and open a small practice of my own, 3 of us now, doing exactly the kind of work that found my father. Forensic accounting for families untangling estates, trusts, and small businesses where the money and the relationships have gotten too tangled to see clearly from inside. I named the firm after my mother, quietly, in a way most clients will never notice unless they ask. Josh proposed in December in our kitchen, badly over dishes, because he knows me well enough to know that a restaurant with an audience would have made me self-conscious instead of happy. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I still send flowers to my mother's grave every month, the same florist subscription I used to run through the Voss family holdings card without a second thought. I pay for it myself now, out of my own account, which shouldn't feel like it means anything and somehow means almost everything. Some months I drive out there myself instead of letting the subscription handle it, and I stand there for a few minutes and tell her, out loud, feeling a little foolish and not stopping anyway, that the trapdoor worked. I think about that phone call in the parking lot more than I expected to, even now. Not because it was the worst moment of the whole thing. The worst moment was quieter, sitting at my kitchen table at midnight, finding my own name on a lie my father had built in advance. But because it was the moment I understood something I think a lot of us learn far too late, if we learn it at all. That the people who raised us are not always who they say they are when they're cornered, and that loving someone honestly sometimes means trusting a stack of bank statements over the version of them you've been protecting in your own head for 30 years. My mother knew that 11 months before she died. She built a trapdoor into her own estate instead of a confrontation because she understood something I only came to understand myself, months into an investigation I never wanted to run. Sometimes the kindest, strongest thing you can do for the people you love is make sure the truth can hold its ground even when you are not in the room to defend it. I don't know what I would tell you to do if you were sitting where I sat in that parking lot, card declined, a parent's voice on the other end of the phone rewriting your whole history in a single sentence. I know what I did, and I know it cost me a relationship I am still not sure I will ever get back in the shape it used to have. But I would rather have the truth and a fractured Sunday dinner than a comfortable lie and a father who quietly needed me to keep being the explanation for what he had done. If you had been me, I wonder whether you would have made the same call to Thomas, or let the story your father was writing about you simply stand, the way I almost did for one more year out of nothing but the exhausting habit of keeping the peace. If this found you at the end of a long day, or somewhere in the middle of a family situation that felt a little too familiar while you were listening, I would genuinely like to know. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if any part of this looked like something you have lived through yourself, even a little. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the quiet, calculated moments where someone finally stops accepting the version of events they were handed and goes looking for the truth instead, stick around and subscribe. There are more of these coming, and I have a feeling you already know exactly why you keep watching them.